Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? I'm drowning in my water cup, apparently. These things are dangerous. It's a handheld swimming pool, basically, these cups of water. And if you swallow them wrong, as you know, if you don't follow all the safety rules with your cups of water, you can get yourself in trouble. And I'm doing it right now. Good morning. It is Monday, November 23rd, 2015. It is currently a live show. At some point in the future, this will, of course, be a recorded rebroadcast, at which point you will know we're not live. If it is not November 23rd, 2015, where you are, either too bad for you or congratulations for living on the other side of the international date line or whatever, as the case may be. We don't have that many listeners, I don't think, on the other side of the date line. But hey, welcome. If you are, tell us what the headlines are tomorrow so that we can stay ahead of the game. Haha, I bet no one ever makes that joke to you. Sorry, guys. Anyway, rolling forward today, we have plenty to cover. The outrageous xenophobia and all sorts of phobias got worse than ever. I guess over the weekend, Donald Trump continues to go crazy, and I guess there's just no getting rid of him for the time being. So we'll catch up on that. We have Ben Carson, who is, I had to just step in seconds before going on the air with a correction for the Washington Post. Did it for free. They don't even have to pay for this. Ben Carson, we're told by Fred Barbish over at the Washington Post. Ben Carson, author of a book about the Constitution, incorrectly states that Thomas Jefferson crafted it. And I had to help them with that. I mean, he really did do that, but I did put the bunny ears, air quotes in there around author and book and the Constitution and all those things he thought he was writing about. I imagine we should look this up. It's the book is called My Battles with the Constitution. No, where is it? There's a More Perfect Union is the name of the book, and thankfully there is a link to it in Amazon. Hallelujah, because then we can find out who's the actual author. I know it says Ben Carson on the book, but who really wrote it? Candy Carson? Is that his wife? Are they the two authors together? There's no other ghost writer or anything? I know you can still do that. You can get a ghost writer who will write the thing for you for a fee and then not put their name on it. I wonder if that's what happened here. Unless maybe Candy Carson is something of a historian too. Is Candy Carson his? I don't know what his wife's name is. But I was looking for a co-author on that one, as I've seen on his other books, because I believe the book gets it right about whether or not Jefferson wrote the Constitution. He didn't. We've mentioned that a number of times back in other episodes of the show, but you also probably know that already because you took a U.S. history course and you remember it. And anyway, when it comes to getting it down in writing, he gets it right because he has Candy Carson is his spouse. So there you have it. Very good. And in the book, they apparently get it right. The article, for whatever it's worth, it's a fun thing, says that it's true that he gets it right. Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention, although he writes he was missing in action, serving in Paris as Minister to France. I don't know if that's really missing in action, but okay. I guess if a brain surgeon says it, it must be true. Anyway, but in person, when he's asked about things, or when he goes off on the topic of Thomas Jefferson, or in particular, it seems, on gun control, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm sure that he generally outlined kind of what he wanted to talk about in the book, and Candy did the tough job of looking things up and figuring out what to actually put in words. But on his own, off the top of his head, I guess he says in an interview with C-SPAN over the weekend on Sunday, said that Jefferson is one of the most impressive of the founding fathers because He tried to craft our Constitution in a way that it would control people's natural tendencies and control the natural growth of the government, which he didn't. But he had some impact, of course, on the formulations in the Constitution, just because he was so influential in the country's founding. But he wasn't there for the writing of the Constitution. True enough. Not the first time, the article says, that Carson has abused Jefferson's history. Thomas Jefferson himself said, and this is really ridiculous. Again, in the book, they get it right, in the sense that they quote Jefferson on what appears to be a sort of a founding era discussion of gun rights and the right to bear arms. And there actually is a contemporaneous quote. It's just not written by Jefferson. It was quoted by Jefferson in a notebook of some kind, but attributed to someone else. And in the book, in the written version of this gobbledygook, they get it right and they attribute it to the right person. But again, on his own, without the book in front of him or without a script, or who knows how he likes to work, maybe teleprompters for all I know, Carson can't get it right. Carson's version of, well, what's the real quote? In the book, Carson repeats a version of the similar statement, which I'll read to you in a minute, noting what he called Thomas Jefferson's warning. And it, in fact, is attributed correctly, I think, even in his book, that it comes from Cesare Beccaria, who writes this. Jefferson read it and noted it in his own notebooks, but the quote says, and you'll recognize that this is more florid, founding era language, right? The laws that forbid the carrying of arms, ellipses, disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes, ellipses. Such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather than encourage them. It actually says that, but I suspect that's wrong. They serve rather than to, how would it even mean for this to go? They serve rather to encourage than to prevent homicides, I assume is what it really is supposed to say. For an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an unarmed man. The supposed Jefferson comment on gun control is listed among many spurious quotations by the Monticello website. This is not something Jefferson wrote, say the researchers there, but rather comes from a passage he included in his Legal Commonplace book. The passage, they note, was written by Cesare Beccaria, or Beccaria, I'm not sure how you would, it's the double C's, but anyway, in his Essays on Crime and Punishments, and a copy was obtained, I guess, and it was copied into his notebooks by Jefferson. I don't know what the Legal Commonplace book actually is. Oddly, it says Carson's footnote to the quote duly notes that it comes from Beccaria and not Jefferson. So good job there on the book, I guess. Candy, we'll credit you. Now here's what, this is just give you an idea of what kind of guy he is. Here's Carson's I'll wing it version of that otherwise relatively lucid and, if a little florid, quote. He's being interviewed by Neil Cavuto on Fox, and after the Umpqua Community College shooting, remember that one? Roseburg, Oregon, in early October. He says, Thomas Jefferson himself said, error right there off the bat, and here's what he says, here's what he's quoting Thomas Jefferson. Gun control works great for the people who are law-abiding citizens, and it does nothing for the criminals, and all it does is put the people at risk. That's his version of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas freaking Jefferson. Hey, gun control works great, said Thomas Jefferson, founding father. For the criminals, I mean, and look at how he gets it, it's sort of back. We have to figure out what he means by this. Gun control works great for the people who are law-abiding citizens. Really? Terrific. Fantastic. Bring it on. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I'd love to have some gun control. Oh, I see what you mean. It works to convince people who are law-abiding citizens not to carry guns, and it does nothing for the criminals, not meaning it means it doesn't convince them to stop carrying guns. Ah, I see. That is a backwards and completely bonkers way of saying it. Not to mention the fact, you imagine Thomas Jefferson rising in convention. Of course, it wouldn't have been the Constitutional Convention. So perhaps at the Continental Congress, or else during the time of the Constitutional Convention, perhaps he rose in France at some point and said, Madame and Monsieur, gun control works great for the people who are law-abiding citizens, and it does nothing for the criminals. All it does is put the people at risk. Now, he was from Virginia, so he probably didn't sound like that, but that's such a dumb statement. I attributed it to my own home region, where I'm most comfortable with dumb statements like that. I guess being Virginian, I don't even know how the Virginia accents of the late 1700s, I don't know what that sounded like. So we won't even try it. Gun control works great. I really doubt. I know he was winging it and everything, but you have this beautiful quote. Don't bother studying it or anything, or even really, paraphrasing it in at least more elegant terms. Gun control freaking great for the law-abiding citizens. Nothing for the criminals. I don't know. Anyway, of course, that is rather a dumb-sounding accent, and I guess the right-wing nutjob crowd will now get a hold of that and say, that was so racist because Ebonics. You used Ebonics there to make him sound dumb, and of course, those of you who even know what Ebonics is, if you can remember that little flap from way back when, will know, nah, it doesn't sound like Ebonics at all. But that won't stop anybody from getting upset about it. Anyway, why should you stop from getting upset about things? Here's a list of things to be upset about by Greg Dworkin, MD. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Good morning. I called in, so that's worth, being upset about, I suppose.
Yeah, right. I'm already mad.
Yeah, exactly.
How are you?
I'm great. I'm trying, as you often do, to get the show in my head, but also read Twitter at the same time.
Yes.
And this thing came by, to be mad about. In the last week of the month, emergency room visits for low blood sugar in low-income diabetics increases 27%.
Last week of this month?
In the last week of any month.
Any month. Oh, okay. I see where we're going. Okay.
In the last week of any month, the emergency room visits for low blood sugar in low-income diabetics increases 27%.
Yes. Why?
Right? Why?
Yes.
They run out of food.
Aha.
Keep taking their insulin, but they run out of food.
Yeah, we should probably
have to follow that up. It's just
a
tweet. I don't have a link, but that was kind of interesting and caught my eye. Want to be mad about something? Be mad about that.
How much does that cost?
Food?
Well, no.
Or being mad?
Food I'm aware of. But I wonder what the cost of that is. A 27% increase in emergency department visits?
Yeah.
How
much does that cost?
Yeah.
Oh, well, they're poor. They don't pay for it.
Well, yes.
You pay for it. What's the matter?
Yeah, so why not? They should just go ahead and do it. It's okay.
As my friend Jake will also always add, you commie simp.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's problematic. We should probably slash something. What?
I would think, yeah. Let's slash food stamps and make it the last half of every month.
Yes.
Call it a win.
Right. Or we could double it to 50% increase, I guess. And I think we should give people more time to have those insulin crashes. Spread it out along a whole half a month. That way everyone can get one in, even if you're working two jobs.
Right. So it's Monday, and Donald Trump is still in the lead in the polls.
Yeah.
There's a very handy little guide from Real Clear Politics I put at the top of today's Monday list here.
I see.
And what they do is they list all the polls for each day and their results. So if you're curious, has there been a new poll? This is a real useful place to do it. You can also look on the Huffington Post, but I notice a couple of differences between the two places. I prefer Huffington Post in the long run because they include polls that are online, and they include IVR polls. They include all polls. And Real Clear Politics has a very arbitrary, we take this one, but we don't take that one. Because they don't include online panels, you'll find that except they do YouGov with CBS, so they do some but not others. You'll find that the Trump lead is greater in the Huffington Post poll that does all polls than the Real Clear Politics that excludes online panels or some online panels, like Morning Report, for example. And that's because those online panels tend to very much favor Trump by maybe 5 or 6 points. And the theory there has been, we've talked about on the show, that maybe these are people that don't normally vote but decided to be included in the panel.
I see.
And if they don't vote, it doesn't help you when you come to the primary. You actually have to get out and vote, or a caucus like Iowa, where you not only have to get out and vote, you have to get out and vote on a cold night, which in this case will be the very beginning of February. So here are some fascinating polls that came out over the weekend showing Trump's strength. For example, ABC Washington Post poll, Trump is plus 10 nationally. He's at 32. And everybody talks about, gee, Trump is so strong. I can't believe how much he's stayed on top of the polls. He's 32, he's 31, he's 32, he's 32. Clinton is 60, 6-0, not 1-6, in that same poll. So Trump's up by 10, Clinton's up by 26, but nobody wants to talk about that because it's boring. So next, you look at the individual states. CBS YouGov has Trump plus 9 in Iowa, Trump plus 19 in New Hampshire. New Hampshire's always been a stronger state than Iowa for him. And in South Carolina, he's leading by 16 as Carson fades a bit. Also, the most fascinating poll of all was, this weekend at least, the New Hampshire Republican presidential primary.
Okay.
Boston Globe Suffolk runs a poll. Trump 22, Rubio 11, Cruz 9. Right? Trump is first, Rubio second, Cruz is third.
Oh.
Maybe. This is weird. Trump 22, Rubio 11, Cruz 9, Carson 10.
Okay.
Bush, so they got Carson and Cruz mixed up there. I got to go check out and see what they actually said. Doesn't matter. Trump is first, Rubio second is the important thing there. Bush is only at 8, Kasich at 9, Christie fading. And so it has this poll where Trump is in the lead. And yet, if you include Mitt Romney in that poll, guess what happens? 2-1 win over Trump.
Well.
He would have 31 and Trump would have 15. Now, I'm sure this is profoundly interesting, except I'm still trying to figure out why. In other words, what's going on here? To me, first of all, New Hampshire's always been a strong state for Mitt Romney. He lived in New Hampshire. He had a second or fifth or 17th home there. He's from neighboring Massachusetts. People know him well. They like him. And yet at the same time, I think it just gives us an idea of the volatility of the Republican primary. And so part of my theme for my brief segment this morning is going to be Trump voters. Because I think he's doing a great job in consolidating the George Wallace vote.
Yes.
Which is going to be 30%.
I guess so.
People write about it as if it's 70% or Hillary 60%. It's not. Okay? He's got very strong white working class voters who have been following him. In fact, I have an article we talked about on the show, I know, because it was a good one, by Evan Osnos, O-S-N-O-S, which was back in August of 2015. The fearful and the frustrated, Donald Trump's nationalist coalition takes shape, at least for now. This paragraph I'll read to you. Trump's fans project onto him a vast range of imaginings, which is not surprising. Same thing happened with Obama. About toughness, business acumen, honesty, from a continuum that ranges from economic and libertarian conservatives. And it's so quaint, but I remember writing about libertarian populism way back a couple of years ago when Rand Paul looked hot, to the far right fringe. I didn't really think libertarian populism exists. I think it doesn't. It's just mostly populism, and it's Juan Perón, George Wallace, Pat Buchanan type populism. Anyway, in partisan terms, his ideas are riven by contradiction. He calls for mass deportations, but opposes cuts to Medicare and Social Security. He vows to expand the military, but criticizes free trade. And yet, that is a reflection of voters' often incoherent sets of convictions. The biggest surprise in Trump's following, he's made an incredible surge among the Tea Party supporters. This is back in August. before Trump announced his candidacy, only 20% of Tea Partiers had a favorable view of him. A month later, that figure had risen to 56%. Trump became the top choice among Tea Party voters, supplanting and opening a large lead over Cruz and Walker. According to a Washington Post ABC News poll conducted last month, that would be in July of this year. The broad majority of Trump supporters hail from two groups: voters with no college degree and voters who say that immigrants weaken America. By mid-August, Trump was even closing in on Hillary Clinton, and Clinton was leading 51-45. And, and she's still leading about 5 or 6 points if you look at the Real Clear Politics website, which summarizes head-to-head polls. The only poll, in fact, that has Trump beating Hillary is the Fox News poll. Always has Trump ahead by 5, always had. Last 3-4 polls. Every other poll has Hillary winning by that same amount. So Fox News polls, not because they're Fox, they're a reputable pollster who does this, but they sort of see the world the way Quinnipiac does. They're looking at a 2014 electorate, but it's 2016, and the question is it more like 2014 or is it more like 28 and 2012? That's a piece on the table here. But what you have is basically, to me, Trump's voters are very familiar because these are the people I grew up with in Yonkers, New York. What we used to call Reagan Democrats.
I know them.
White, lower class, non-college degree, angry. They were angry at protesters and hippies then. And, they're just as angry now. So I have this piece from Wikipedia on George Wallace, just reminding us. There's a little section there in the Wikipedia entry called Campaign Rhetoric.
Okay.
Wallace's campaign rhetoric became infamous, such as when he pledged, if any anarchists lie down in front of my automobile, it'll be the last automobile they ever lie down in front of, and asserted that the only 4-letter words that hippies do not know were W-O-R-K and S-O-A-P.
Okay.
He accused Humphrey and Nixon of wanting to desegregate the South. He recanted later in life, but this is the 1968 election. Wallace proclaimed, and I think foreshadowing Ross Perot, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Democrat and Republican parties. A line he first used in 1966 when his first wife, Lurleen Wallace, ran successfully governor against the Republican James Martin.
Yes. That was, I think, Nader liked that line.
Everybody liked it.
Yeah.
And they didn't acknowledge where it was from, but we know now. The Wallace campaign in California and other states attracted the radical right, including the John Birch Society. And although most mainstream media editorials expressed opposition to the Wallace campaign, some Southern newspapers enthusiastically backed him. Of course, pretty funny stuff. New leftist Jack Newfield, who by 1971 had become critical of both his movement and consensus liberals like Humphrey, wrote that year, I cannot recall either Johnson in 64 or Humphrey in 68 campaigning on any positive or exciting ideas that might excite the almost poor workers whose votes they took for granted. In contrast, George Wallace has been sounding like William Jennings Bryan as he attacked concentrated wealth in his speeches. So it's fascinating. He wanted Bryan lost, by the way, but his famous Cross of Gold speech. If you want to trace populism back to that time, I suppose you could, but certainly it's not a stretch to say that Donald Trump is a whole lot less Ross Perot and a whole lot more George Wallace with a little Buchanan thrown in.
Yeah.
Wallace at least concentrated on economics plus segregation, and Trump is doing immigration plus a little bit of economics. That what the other article described as the incoherent mix of what we see from actual voters. How do we know that? Because they make signs.
Yes.
No socialist medicine and get your hair off, get your hands off my hair. That is a classic example of a George Wallace incoherent. But you're right. This is what I think, and thank you for saying it because nobody has the guts to say so. Kind of idea.
Right. Yeah. He says out loud what other people incoherently think to themselves.
Right. Which is, by the way, also as you were pointing out, why Ben Carson is so popular.
Yes.
He gets it wrong the way we do. He's one of us.
Right. I guess so. Although even a good percentage of people actually do know that Jefferson didn't write the Constitution, but a fairly significant chunk think he did, and also maybe the Bible.
And besides, he didn't until Carson says he did, and if Carson says he did, now I believe he did. I mean, there's a whole lot of that kind of thinking
because
that's what leaders mean. You know,
yes,
that's what it's to lead.
He's a
You should
brain
get
surgeon,
people
he
to
knows.
convince that what you say is wrong is in fact right. So you have that, and I think that that matches a more contemporaneous article here, contemporary article by Bill Galston, writing in the Wall Street Journal, talking about, again, recent polling. Trump rides a blue-collar wave. 55% of his supporters are white working class. And it's behind a paywall, but it doesn't matter. That's really the gist of it. So the question remains, how many voters are there, as per our discussion about Trump in the polls?
A lot of voters, man.
It is, but is it a majority of voters?
Oh, I think
Because if it's not, you lose. I mean, the
I thought
whole
you were
thing.
just generally asking how many voters are there.
Well, yeah, you're right.
A lot of them. They're
a
all
lot,
over
man.
the place.
Yeah, you got to add the man at the end, otherwise it's not an accurate statement.
Right.
So
It's like the Fox question mark. This is our thing.
some people say there's a lot, man. Yeah, but the point is really that Trump's voters are going to be loyal to him, just as Carson voters are going to be loyal to Carson. And that matters in the sense of expecting them to fall. They're going to have their section of that divided electorate. The bigger question is, how big is that section? And just because they have voters that won't desert them, does that mean they win? You know, Trump is doing 22% or so in New Hampshire, but, you know, it's enough to win when you have a very divided field. Is it enough to win if it's one-on-one? And it isn't clear it is. And so, you know, giving him the win already, talking about how strong he is already, you know, suggesting that, you know, he's going to be the next president already just seems to me remarkably premature, because it's not really clear how all of this is going to shake out. He's going to keep his 20%. When has that ever been enough to win? In fact, 25% or so of Americans always identify themselves as being Tea Party. Sometimes less, sometimes more. It's far from a majority, and yet the media writes about it as if it's the only thing, because that happens to be the Fox voters.
No, that's true.
But it's not the only thing, and it's not a majority, and you don't always win.
That is also true. What is happening here? Too many truths.
Yeah, well, you know, the media does what's interesting. They don't do what's real. They're doing a terrible job of correcting Donald Trump in terms of inaccuracies. They don't do a good job in anybody's. But he was on the Sunday shows claiming that when the World Trade Center towers went down, people in New Jersey were clapping and cheering, thousands of them, except it never happened.
Well, some say it.
But it never happened. And he said, no, it did because I saw it, except he's about as right as Carson is about who wrote the Constitution.
Yeah, that was interesting, too. And I guess I'd like him, well, I don't care whether he clarifies it or not, but it was interesting that I saw it, you know,
I
on
believe
TV.
it, therefore it's true.
I saw it. You saw it? Well, I saw it on TV. You saw it on TV. Well, I saw it on the Internet that someone else saw it on TV.
Yeah, and what they saw on the Internet, they said on the Internet that they saw on TV was, you know, could have been Beirut.
Right. I mean, I can show you pictures of people cheering.
Beirut, New Jersey, what's the difference?
Right. I don't know
You
what
know,
they're...
all you guys trying to do gotchas on foreign policy, you know, where is this city located? Come on. We're talking about what people think here.
Right. I should just start circulating cheering crowds in Yankee Stadium. Look what they're doing for 9/11.
They're all Yankee fans. Everybody in the country is Yankee fans.
I can't believe it.
Not that people challenge.
By the way, I do have video of Mitt Romney cheering after Benghazi. And that's a famous picture now. I mean, that's as much cheering as a guy like Mitt
Marco
Romney
Rubio
does.
do. Marco Rubio, the guy who said over the weekend that Paris is probably good for his campaign.
Yes.
And he actually did say that.
His first ad out of the box is exactly that. Oh my God, fear. That's interesting too, because usually, well, you do read whenever they do think pieces about the first ads that candidates do. Every once in a while, you write such things, and they say that as a matter of conventional wisdom, television spot number one is introductory biography. You know, soft-focused stuff. So, interesting that first time out of the box for Marco Rubio, it is, oh my God, we're all going to die.
Well, here's the interesting piece on that from Greg Sargent, bringing in the new Washington Post poll that's at least data's out this morning on. He writes, will the terror attacks in France make it more likely that the 2016 election will be about foreign policy and national security, thus giving an automatic edge to the GOP? Some Republicans appear to think that's the case. Because if you ask generically, who do you trust more, it's generally the GOP. They have had a lead on this in most polls for like ever. Marco Rubio's first television ad proclaims, "What happened in Paris could happen here." And Donald Trump is road testing a new terrorism-related attack line in Hillary Clinton, claiming Clinton lacks the stamina to be president and deal with the terrorists who only understand strength. After 11 hours of Benghazi hearings, that's kind of funny. But
yeah, it's also just nothing that has.
He got tired after 2.5 hours,
yeah.
and he did 3-hour debates. So let's not talk too much about stamina there. Anyway,
it's weird. It doesn't resonate in any way. Like the low-energy attacks, people could see what he was talking about. This is just dumb.
Yeah.
He thought it would work. Okay.
Well, writes Greg Sargent, the new Washington Post ABC News poll would seem to undercut this pleasing little storyline. It finds Americans trust Clinton more than all her GOP rivals to handle the terrorism issue. Hey, go ahead, pick a candidate. Let's play a game on the radio. Pick a candidate on the Republican side, and I'll tell you how Hillary stacks up against her. Who would you trust more to handle the threat of terrorism? Hillary Clinton or fill in the Republican?
Rick Santorum.
Right between the eyes. Hit me with one.
Rick Santorum.
I can't because I don't think they bothered.
No, I knew it. All right. Jim Gilmore.
Give me a leading candidate.
All right, Marco Rubio.
Or as Jim Webb would say on Saturday Night Live, pass. Marco Rubio?
Sure.
So Hillary's 47, Rubio's 43.
Okay.
Beats Rubio.
Right, but he got water, so that helped him.
Right.
All right, Ted Cruz.
48-40.
48-40.
Beats Cruz even bigger.
Hmm.
In fact, Cruz is just about the second biggest. The biggest probably is the 49-40 for Carson.
Okay.
50-42 for Trump. It's pretty good.
Okay.
Right? And Bush is closest, 46-43, which reflects Republican thinking, which is to say, if you ask them, and I think that the Bloomberg National Poll with Ann Seltzer was the one that did this, who do you think has the most experience? Who do you think is the experienced person whose experience helps them be the most experienced to experience the presidency? And it's Bush by a lot.
Huh.
But if you ask, who do you like personality-wise? It's Carson. And who are you going to vote for? It's Trump.
Wow.
In other words, people acknowledge that Bush has more governance experience, including governing experience, including being governor experience. Plus, he has his whole family set of advisors to go with him.
That's it.
So people understand all of that. But that's not what the Republican Party's looking for. They want change.
Okay.
Change. They're not voting for him. And that's why you add up Carson, Trump, or Carson, Trump, Cruz, or Carson, Trump, Fiorina, or any, Carson, Trump alone. Half or more of the Republican electorate doesn't value experience, even after Paris, as much as they value change. And Democrats don't feel that way. It could be because of who the candidate is.
Could be.
But they value experience. And if you look at the general electorate, which is what this is looking at, they understand that having some degree of experience in handling terrorism is kind of useful. Unlike, let's say, Ben Carson, who does worst here.
Yeah. I don't know. I can't. It's very hard to imagine any of them dealing with anything like this situation. I guess they could all have dealt with this happening in Paris.
Right.
Okay, I know what to do. I'm sorry.
But that goes back to that article in August we were talking about, where Trump voters, put on him all sorts of things they imagine that they want to be true.
Yeah.
And again, to be fair, in 2008 specifically, not so much 2012 when people knew him a little better, but in 2008, Obama could be anything you wanted him to be. Because you didn't know him that well.
Mm-hmm.
Liberal? Sure. Moderate? Fine. New? Absolutely. Going to change the way race relations are in this country? Why not? Whatever it is, you could project a little bit of what your hopes were on his particular candidacy, which he knew and played it that way, and that's how he won.
That must be because he knows what he's doing.
Well, decent politician. Trump is a decent politician. He's doing something similar. He doesn't really like getting pinned down on details.
No.
But when it comes to the, don't dare lie in front of my limousine because I'll run you over kind of approach, he's upfront about that. So people are real clear. At least his white working class angry voters are pretty clear as to where he stands on things like protests.
Yes. Well, that is something he's uniquely qualified to do, in that's a guy who doesn't care what happens to him, generally speaking. George Wallace I mean, I guess he was okay no matter whether he won or lost. But I guess if you're a billionaire, just wing it and say, yeah, I would run people over. So fine, I'm not
what if those protesters are wearing IEDs? You know, what happens to your limousine?
He's got an up-armored limo.
Well, you know, still do some damage there.
Oh, well.
You know, some of the details don't all fit together. I mean,
he would do a terrific job at surviving.
I suppose. If anybody would survive, it would be he.
It would be a very classy, terrific
survival story there.
I mean, I guess that's all he just says. You know, you confront him about details like that, and well, we would just do it terrifically. It's about management, is what I mean. Just you got to run over people the right way. Oh, okay.
Anyway, to finish Greg Sargent's thought, what's striking here is it comes even as Obama's approval on terrorism is down to 40%. As post-polling guru Scott Clement notes, the poll shows a sizable block of voters who disapprove of Obama on terrorism, but nonetheless say they trust Clinton over her GOP rivals on the issue. There's little question that if the election is focused on foreign policy, her role in helping the Obama administration formulate the same will come under intense scrutiny and certainly could emerge as a vulnerability, depending upon how international events go over the next year. If Obama, in fact, does have the right policy, the trouble with it is that part of it is avoiding doing stupid things, and that doesn't show up in front of your eyeballs as much as doing something really stupid and then seeing how stupid that was that you really did, because now it's a disaster.
Yes.
To avoid the disaster, it's not as clear as if you are trying to deal with something and it's a slow roll, even if it's the right thing. Anyway, but this poll suggests voters may at least be open to evaluating Clinton, which is the important thing when you're electing somebody, who has received good press for her detailed and knowledgeable public discussions of foreign policy, including her last speech, independently of the administration which she served and on her own terms. To be clear, he says, I don't think this new polling is predictive of anything. It's one poll, and others may show the opposite. We don't know much of anything about how this is going to all turn out, he writes. But this poll does show that it may be folly to assume that at the outset that the attacks will give a boost to the GOP's 2016 hopes simply on the strength of a presumed GOP advantage in national security issues. And I'm reminded, although I don't have the right quote in front of me, but Karl Rove saying something along the lines of when Bush was in power, an attack on the U.S. will solidify his win in 2004, but recently saying an attack on this country will solidify Democrats' loss in 2016, because I don't know why.
Because
that's just the way it is.
Mm-hmm. That's why we have a Republican.
Because bombs going off are always good for Republicans, and it's always bad for Democrats. You know, just like whatever Donald Trump says, even though it's completely wacky and wrong and bordering on fascist, is good politics, because a certain small segment of the Republican Party like him, as if they'll all turn out and vote for him when it comes to vote. That remains to be seen. So that's the summary for this morning. A little of this, a little of that. I suppose, to be fair, we should mention David Vitter. He lost.
Yes, that guy.
A piece from Salon, and the author is Robert Mann. Robert Mann is a reporter from Louisiana who's done great coverage of this. Robert, M-A-N-N.
Yeah.
Robert Mann. The pundits will offer these and other plausible theories about how Louisiana Democratic Governor-elect John Bel Edwards defied enormous odds in Saturday's election and vanquished Vitter, a Republican and the once prohibitive favorite. Each theory is probably valid. For example, the prostitution scandal, or vicious attacks against Republican opponents, or a well-funded Democratic opponent this time. Those are the other theories. My analysis, says Robert Mann, however, is simple. It's about how Vitter and his aides incorrectly analyzed the race more than a year ago. I believe that Vitter lost to Edwards for the same reason the U.S. lost the Vietnam War to Ho Chi Minh's Viet Cong.
Oh.
Like the hapless U.S. generals and their Pentagon bosses in the 60s, Vitter made several fatal miscalculations. First, he underestimated and misunderstood his opponent, and he fought with once successful but now outdated strategies in previous campaigns. Full disclosure, last spring I would not have disputed Vitter's strategy. I wrote it would probably work. But in his book on war, the Prussian general and military theorist Karl von Clausewitz observed that the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war in which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its true nature. See Syria, by the way. This is the first of all strategic questions and the most comprehensive. So
Okay.
If you badly misjudge your opponent and you have your battle on the wrong battlefield, you lose. Is this familiar? It absolutely is. I'll give you one example from recent history that's fresh in my mind, and that would be Chris Murphy running in the 5th District in Connecticut as a newcomer against established Republican Nancy Johnson. And Chris Murphy is the new face, walking door to door, meeting the constituents, talking about how he has to change things in Washington. And in opposition, the well-established, been there for a long time, Nancy Johnson, is running a bunch of ads, and I think this was 2006, although I could be wrong, about, is Chris Murphy ready for that midnight call? Terrorism, the ads, they have the fuzzy pictures, black and white, and then they have the ominous music playing in the background. Is Chris Murphy ready for this call? And that was not in the least bit what the constituents in Connecticut 5 were worried about. They were worried about the economy. That was first, not terrorism. And they thought the war was a bad idea. So she lost. And it was a big upset at the time, but not for people who lived here. I suppose that's also true for people who live in Louisiana. They see it coming because Vitter's running this ad as his closer about how his opponent Edwards is soft on Syrian refugees. Edwards is a West Point graduate.
Oh.
It doesn't work.
Well, he's a soft West Point graduate.
Yeah, that's not a great sell.
No?
Soft. Didn't work. He lost.
It was worth a try. You know what came to mind just briefly during the beginning part of your recapping of the Salon article was the admission by Robert Mann to saying, well, I admit that I would have analyzed the race the same way a year ago, and it brought to mind the now, I think, already infamous Chris Cillizza piece about, well, it's smart politics. It's such smart politics to be so anti-refugee, for instance, and that may yet bear out, but it's interesting that sometimes conventional wisdom doesn't look all that wise a few months down the road. Oh, but I would have guessed the same thing, and I did. I'm glad when people say, yeah, I did that. Oops. But
it wasn't smart. And it certainly wasn't smart politics.
Yeah, it didn't work here.
And those two, I granted, can be different, but sometimes not.
Yeah, and it may just be that he didn't have time to catch fire with his anti-refugee message, and another month of runoff, and it might have been a different story. I don't know.
But that still points to the fact that he just did it wrong.
Yes, he should not have been endangered, and although it seems like everybody gets caught up in the runoff system in Louisiana, so I don't know they would have avoided that, but.
You know that Bobby Jindal, who won't be the governor anymore, and Vitter, who says he'll serve out his year in the Senate and then not run for Senate anymore. They hate each other.
I could see that.
They really strongly loathe each other.
I wonder why.
Yeah.
I really do. I don't have any idea. I don't care, but okay. I'm glad
they loathe
do.
Each other. They cannot stand each other. Vitter blames his loss on Jindal's lagging popularity in Louisiana.
Sure.
And Jindal says basically Vitter as a human being is something of a scuzzy kind of example of one, and so it's his own fault. Okay, so that's the background, and they've been feuding for a long times. So Jindal announced he wasn't going to be running for president, and he was pulling out of the race.
Yes, right.
But the timing of his announcement was right at the end of this Louisiana governorship campaign, gubernatorial campaign. And he makes the announcement the day after Vitter pivots with this Syrian refugee thing. Mm-hmm. So the Vitter camp thinks that Jindal did this deliberately because now everybody's, as somebody put it, there just aren't that many political reporters in Louisiana. And now everybody's running to talk about Jindal and Jindal pulling out, and nobody's paying attention to Vitter, and nobody's paying attention to his, I called 4 press conferences that I had to cancel because nobody was showing up to talk about my opponent's position on Syrian refugees. And so the Vitter camp thinks that Jindal stepped on their message right at the end, and that was part of the reason why they lost.
Well, you can think that. I don't know.
Yes.
That seems pretty far-fetched to me.
When you don't like somebody, you're going to blame it on whoever.
Right.
Not only did he have terrible, favorables and job approval, this Governor Jindal that we can't stand. But then he does this to our campaign. So the fact that we lost is his fault.
Sure, why not?
It had nothing to do with my
That
history.
is
It had nothing to do with
very
the man.
Yeah, right. You didn't get punched so hard between the eyes. The prostitutes versus patriots.
That is going to be a classic
killed.
ad that goes down with the Daisy ad.
Yeah, that was a killer. And all right, fine. You know what? Yeah, it's Bobby Jindal's fault. Go for it.
Yeah.
By all means, continue. I don't care. Stew in whatever you want, as long as you stew privately.
Yeah.
Get
Just
lost.
doing whatever gumbo you would like, but, just get out. So, there's that. That happened. You got to acknowledge that. That was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So that's my summary for today, talking with David Waldman, Kagro in the morning. Let's talk just a tad about schedule for the week.
Okay.
So you're here today, and you'll finish the show, or so I'm led to believe, right?
Yes.
Tomorrow we're here?
Yeah.
Wednesday not?
Well, I don't.
Thursday and Friday definitely.
Yeah,
not, right?
definitely. I think we should try and get one in on Wednesday if you're available.
I'm available.
All right. Well, we can try and do it. It might be a little noisy on this end, but we shouldn't go that long without Joan McCarter.
Right. As listeners know, I have nothing else to do, so I never get off. So yeah, I'll be here on Wednesday.
I mean, what the hell am I going to do?
What the heck?
Right.
I mean, that's why, after all, as you have properly pointed out, that's 3/4 of the reason why some of these guys are running for the Republican nomination and they're not pulling out. I mean, What else has George Pataki got to do?
Right. I mean, now, in the age of the self-basting turkey, I have even less to do.
Exactly right.
So, why not? I figure we should try and squeeze one in on Wednesday. Joan likes to get her turn. I like to have her on. We don't want to go too long without her. And 2 days off, quite enough.
Okay.
In my opinion.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday, Friday, no show, and then back on Monday again.
Yes.
So with that, let me sign off for real. Greg Dworkin, speaking with David Waldman. Thanks for listening. Thanks for Networks Radio for powering the whole thing, and we'll do it again tomorrow.
All right.
Maybe David Vitter will lose another election between now and then. Who knows?
It's entirely possible.
And then I'll blame it on Jindal.
Okay.
I like that strategy. Whatever happens to me for the rest of the month, I'm blaming it on Bobby Jindal.
Okay, I'm going to do it too.
You try it too. You could try this at home, folks. It won't hurt you.
Yeah, I kind of like that story. That's definitely a good one. I blame it on Bobby Jindal. Why not?
Yeah, I promise you, it won't hurt you. Take care.
Okay, you too. Thanks, Greg. I guess there really must be like 4 reporters in Louisiana. And the old line about walking and chewing gum, I don't know. Have you tried it lately? These days, with these complicated gums the kids have, internet, etc. I don't even know I have no idea why anyone would think that was true. But I guess I could see the idea of, now everybody's concentrating on Jindal, but no one was concentrating on Jindal. It was mostly stories about how no one even knew he was running, it had zero impact, etc. Where are his two voters going to go? And Vitter's a juicy story, even when he's getting killed in the polls because of how juicy his story is. I can't imagine how that could. Well, all right, blame it on whatever you want. Anyway, we're ready to go with the rest of the day. I never did read Bill's kickoff tweet, and I like that he's acknowledging our use of the word tenterhooks in the Morning Post. We are, in fact, we need to acknowledge what's going on in Belgium, of all places. As you know, it turns out that the Paris attacks had a Belgian link. That is, that the attackers were all holders of French and or Belgian citizenship, and at least had spent some time in both countries. Not hard to do over there in the European Union. But now Belgium continually on high alert of some kind. I don't know exactly what that means for the Belgian system of government, but it certainly appears like they're on what amounts to lockdown in all of Brussels, which is pretty incredible. And I understand. I mean, schools are closed. Schools are going to be closed here too, for half the week, and nobody thinks that's about terrorism. But I guess the Belgians had no particular reason to close their schools, other than this imminent threat. And wow, it's just, it's scary, and people are just hunkering down at home with police roaming the streets waiting to try and pick up terror suspects, and they've made some arrests, and quite a few of them at that, but I don't think that they're quite over the hump here in terms of figuring out what exactly was the threat and has it been diffused. It's really a scary situation, but it was also an excuse to use the word tenterhooks. I was thinking they were waiting on pins and needles there, but that's too positive a notion, I think. Tenterhooks. Wow. I don't even remember where I pulled that from. And you can go and look up. Tenterhooks are real kinds of things, too. They're just archaic. Apparently, you used to hang woolen fabric out to dry, like way back when, in the olden days. And there was a lot of, you would stretch the fabric out, and there was a lot of tension, and it just looked painful and was generally uncomfortable looking. I guess, if people personifying the woolen fabric. Why? There was so little to personify back in those days, and you just had to go with what you had. All right, and a good suggestion, by the way, speaking of woolen fabrics, from Blue DuPage, who says that all of us who are going to be here on the show during the week, me, Greg, probably Armando, Joan, need matching sweaters for the Thanksgiving special on Wednesday. It'd be a great idea to add some video to that. Christmas sweaters are usually the ugly matching thing, but I guess Thanksgiving, that makes it suitably Judeo-Christian. And Muslims, as you know, we're kicking them out of Thanksgiving, I guess, because of the Republicans. We don't want to offend any Republicans. All right, well, let's see. Let's go to a couple other stories here. I've opened a couple of the ones that Greg mentioned that sound very interesting and we have to take a closer look at. Then let's see, did we finish up with Ben Carson? I think we got the bulk of that one out. But anyway, the article that they put together here just cites a couple other examples of Ben Carson sort of slipping up on who said what and did such and such a founding father really say this. Thomas Jefferson is constantly having this problem. Well, he's not; he's dead. But the Monticello researchers are constantly having to debunk fake or misleading, perhaps, Thomas Jefferson quotes. I just got a real big kick out of the idea that winging it on his own, Ben Carson just totally dumbs down Thomas Jefferson. Anyway, he's not that good on the founding era, essentially. Aside from the supposed gun control quote, it says, Carson's grasp of the founding era has proven weak in the past. Earlier this month, he asserted that, quote, every signer of the Declaration of Independence had no elected office experience. An outlandish claim considering that all of the members of the Continental Congress, which approved the Declaration, had, of course, been elected by colonial assemblies, and that the primary author of the document, you know the guy, Thomas Jefferson, was, of course, a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, John Adams, Massachusetts Assemblyman, Ben Franklin, you know the guys who wrote the Declaration, or were chiefly responsible for its crafting, anyway. The Committee on Style, actually, is I think how that was, styled. I didn't mean that, but that's what the name of the committee was. And you remember, you might not remember because it's one of the more obscure passages of Schoolhouse Rock if you can't remember the names of the members of the Committee on Style. Only 4 are mentioned here. There's a 5th. Can you tell me who it is? You've got Thomas Jefferson, who was, of course, a member of the House of Burgesses. John Adams, a member of the Massachusetts Assembly. Ben Franklin, a member of the Thrift Store Council of Advisors, Pennsylvania Assembly. And there are 2 more. Roger Sherman, Connecticut General Assembly member. But someone is left out here. Do you know who? And can you name? And is he left out because did he have no electoral experience prior to his having been elected to the Continental Congress? That is a good question. Let's look it up. Without telling you who he is, because it's time for... And don't Google it. Sing the song. Benjamin Franklin. This person comes next. John Adams, Roger Sherman, Thomas Jefferson. That's the way they're listed in the song. We'll look at the career. Let's see. I guess that's why it doesn't say he's just a prominent merchant, so it doesn't say anything about elected experience. Oh no, well there we are. I'll give you a hint. In 1754, he was sent as a delegate to the Albany Congress. So there you go. At that point, he joined delegates from several other colonies to negotiate with Indians and discuss common plans for dealing with the French and Indian War. And he was also a member of the Provincial House of Representatives from 1763 to 1769. 1768, in fact, served as Speaker. And in 1765, he attended the Stamp Act Congress. So I don't know why he's not included in here. If you know the song, it's Benjamin Franklin, Philip Livingston, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Thomas Jefferson. Fifth member of the Committee on Style, not mentioned in the Washington Post piece. Where else would you get such information besides, of course, the widely distributed and much more famous than this show, Schoolhouse Rock? You don't remember how that went? Benjamin Franklin, Philip Livingston, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Thomas Jefferson. They got it done. Oh, yes, they did. No? Doesn't ring a bell. They got it done. The Declaration. Oh, well. Never mind. Look it up. I will, maybe we can find a YouTube of maybe I can find it right now. I bet I could. Why not? Why not derail the show for a cartoon? That's what I would do if I were running the show, and I am. Okay, let's see. What is that? Schoolhouse Rock. It's one of the, admittedly, less famous Schoolhouse Rock, certainly less famous than the Constitution, which is weird because, the Declaration of Independence is a big deal. Here we go. Declaration of Independence. That was it. Fireworks was the name of the song. Maybe that's why we can't remember it. Let's play it. What the hell? Just to refresh your memory, at the very least.
Ooh, there's gonna be fireworks on the 4th of July. Red, white, and blue fireworks like diamonds in the sky. We're gonna shoot the entire works on fireworks that really show, oh yeah, we declared our liberty 200 years ago. In 1776, fireworks. There were fireworks too. The original colonists, their tempers blew. Like Thomas Paine once wrote, it's only common sense that if a government won't give you your basic rights, you better get another government. And though some people tried to fight it, well, a committee was formed to write it. Benjamin Franklin, Philip Livingston, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Thomas Jefferson, they got it done. The Declaration of Independence in 1776. The Continental Congress said that we were free. Said we had the right of life and liberty. And the pursuit of happiness.
You remember that one now. Perhaps that one rings a bell. That, of course, gets us through the committee. The committee was formed to write it. Committee on Sound. I'm telling you, Schoolhouse Rock was literally genius. A little bit of a bit of a sexist bit there, where the pursuit of happiness is illustrated by a man chasing a woman. I don't know. I can't quite tell whether the woman is a willing participant in all of this, but hey, it was the 70s, I'm guessing. Is that about right? And Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, and yargle bargle. So there you have it. It's an imperfect piece, but I'll tell you, lyricists were geniuses. Speaking of Thomas Jefferson, by the way, I am reliably informed by Inside Higher Ed that Jefferson is the next target. It's true. And I guess this was the much worried about, what could we say? Spillover effect of the University of Missouri protests. A lot of people worried that now you are going to see newly emboldened and, I guess, empowered student bodies protesting all over the place, sometimes protesting racism, sometimes protesting other things. And then, of course, those protesting racism, would they be protesting current institutional racism? Would they be protesting historical racism? But the idea was, the worry was, that students would be were now newly emboldened to protest, and they would be able to kick out the presidents of these institutions quite easily now and replace them with some sort of politically correct substitute. And I think they were correct in predicting that there was an emboldening going on, but that's not a very dangerous thing. For one thing, it's about time students got to protesting again. When they put that aside for the last couple of decades, to their great detriment and ours too, I think. But what's missing from the worry, or at least the analysis of those who were worried, is the analysis of the strength of the case the students and others were making at the University of Missouri about it being a current, ongoing, and institutional situation that immediately endangered poisoned the atmosphere, endangered the ability of the students to get a decent education, and in many cases endangered their safety. And they presented a case against a credible, or I was going to say a credible opponent, but really a credible defendant. That is to say, not that he's a credible person in himself, but that this was a credible target. It made sense to people to make complaints about these two top targets in the protest. And the protest, I guess the situation was real and palpable, I guess, enough to a broad enough cross-section of the campus and community that the protest succeeded. Whereas simply saying, racism can now be adequately protested and students can exercise power on that platform doesn't necessarily mean anywhere we see racism of any kind, we can get the entire community to agree to us and allow our grievances to leverage out those in power. That wasn't in the offing. Anywhere you can credibly put together a movement that, it's a test of politics, pure and simple, just like anything else. If you can put together a coalition and it involves the vast majority of key players across all sorts of issues and platforms, campus-wide and community-wide, and get them to agree with you, then you're going to be able to force out the leadership, and you should be able to force out the leadership. But what if it's a really dumb idea? Well, then it either will not succeed in uniting the key players in the community, or it won't actually, or you'll be able to galvanize people around a really dumb issue. Well, so what? We're galvanizing people around incredibly dumb issues all the time in this country, and it hasn't killed us yet, although it doesn't really help. But every once in a while, you'll find that people can galvanize the majority of a community around a dumb idea and do something dumb. But 99% of the time, it won't work. So what are they protesting? We never did catch up on the serious protests going on other campuses. Yale, for instance, I never really got a sense of what was going on there. And I put aside some articles, and maybe we could explore some of that too. But let's see. It has since spread to a couple other campuses, Princeton included, where it just looks like they're not, I guess, likely to succeed on this. And I should say this. One of the other concerns expressed by people who were worried about spillover effect, I guess, from Missouri was, now they can protest totally dumb things. Or, in particular, that the football team would be empowered to protest dumb things and get what they want out of their leverage as players of a big-time lucrative sport. Which I also didn't worry very much about, because I think there's plenty of checks and balances built into that. One being that you have to be willing to potentially put your entire any hopes you have of a professional career on the line in order to make your point. So it's going to have to be a fairly serious thing for people with some serious professional football prospects to say, I'd rather get kicked off the team or forfeit a bunch of games or just not be seen by scouts, et cetera, and forego my professional career than sit silently by. Well, that's a pretty major statement, and it's not going to happen because they want double meatloaf portions on meatloaf night or double cheese and pepperoni on their pizzas or anything like that. Racism? Well, that's different. You might find considerable support there, but it would have to be every day in your face, this affects me now in this era today kind of racism. Now, arguably, all kinds of racism does affect people now today, even if you're really talking about just historical figures. But I think most people will draw a line between the immediately practical situation, which is this current university administration makes it impossible for me to feel safe and learn and grow as a person, versus Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, therefore something at the University of Virginia, or Princeton University's problem with Woodrow Wilson being a racist. All true, and yet you can still get a quality education even though Woodrow Wilson was a racist. There are problems. It permeates today's society too, but it's not an immediate threat to your safety as a student, I don't think, although we'll see whether they can make the case. This is what Inside Higher Ed has to say about what's going on at a couple of these other what's going on with some of these other late blooming protests. And these are probably things that have been simmering for a long time. Anyway, at the University of Missouri and William and Mary, some place notes on statues honoring the author of Declaration of Independence, that would be Thomas Jefferson, calling him a rapist and a racist. Well, I see the point. And yet I don't fear that every college president in America is in danger. In the last week, Princeton University students who object to having Woodrow Wilson's name on an academic unit and a residential college occupied the president's office and left only when promised that the university would review its use of the Wilson name, which is exactly what I would have told you. If I had been paying attention at all to the issue, I probably would have said, what do I think is going to come of an occupation of the president's office over protests of naming something after Woodrow Wilson? The students will get tired of it and will get themselves kicked out, maybe in order to tamp down on the situation in exchange for a promise to review whether or not this naming is a good idea. What else are you going to do? Woodrow Wilson is going to be a little bit hard to dislodge there at Princeton, and I think we can all acknowledge that. Even if all of what he's accused of is true and fair, you're still going to have some considerable difficulty dislodging Woodrow Wilson from Princeton in general. Why? Well, he was a president of the United States. That's a big deal. He was governor of New Jersey, which is where Princeton is, also a very big deal. And as it happens, he was also president of Princeton University, which is, of course, also where Princeton University is, almost entirely co-located with the current Princeton University. So he's not a minor figure at Princeton. Was he a racist? You know what? I'm not that familiar with Woodrow Wilson's personal problems, but people that I generally think know what's going on in terms of who's racist and who isn't say, yeah, he was, and maybe even more so than you can't even just blame it on, well, everyone was racist at the time, which is a fun and popular thing to do. He was more racist than even they were. Okay. And I agree. It deserves some review. But all I'm really saying here is it wasn't the kind of protest that students at Princeton were likely to get others at Princeton to say, I will forego my professional career. It wasn't going to be a professional football career, obviously, even for the football team at Princeton. But I'm willing to put my education on the line here and say, either skip classes, whether it's just that, I'm going to skip classes to go to the protest, or whatever. You weren't going to get the professors at Princeton, for instance, to say, I will be forgiving of people who miss my classes because they're protesting something so immediate and so serious that it just has to be, you have to give them some leeway. They were going to say, you're right. I understand where you are about Woodrow Wilson. We should be reconsidering this, but this is something to debate and fight about in meetings. Occupying the president's office, skipping class. I mean, go ahead and occupy the president's office if you want to, but I'm going to mark you absent. You're not going to get a pass from me just because I think you're right. And if you can't get professors on board with stuff like that and other, a bigger, broader cross-section of the community, and a lot of it is going to be inertia. Why Woodrow Wilson? He was president of the United States. How dare you? And people will take it personally. I'm very patriotic, and I don't think you should dishonor former presidents of the United States, even if they're avowed racists, because all of them probably were up to a certain point. It's unfair to laugh that point off. It's a serious one, but it's just not an immediate threat to the safety of students there. Although, if you're willing to make the case as to why it is, I would sit and listen for a while. But the point is, though, I could probably outlast you when you'd leave the president's office. So anyway, that's where they are. The students pointed out that Wilson was a racist who, as president of the United States, had federal government agencies segregated, reversing progress towards civil rights for black people. Many observers have wondered which historical figure honored on American campuses would be next to capture critical attention. The answer appears to be Thomas Jefferson. At both the University of Missouri, at Columbia, where we began all this, and the College of William and Mary, which is not even in Missouri, but rather in Virginia, critics have been placing yellow sticky notes on Jefferson statues, labeling him, among other things, rapist and racist. And, okay, I can accept that. I'm not Thomas Jefferson, so I'm not really the best guy for defending him. He wrote some interesting things. He did some not very nice things, all of which is true. Okay, once again, students are raising the question of whether men seen as heroes in American history were decidedly unheroic when it came to issues of race, and black students are demanding that colleges consider the impact of various honors for people whom they do not consider heroes. Legit. While Princeton has said it is considering the issue of the Wilson name, which could well remain, the student protest movement has led to widespread discussion of Wilson's record on race. Fine. Good accomplishment. Which even fans of his idealistic internationalist vision admit was horrible. Good. Publications such as Vox and Salon are running articles detailing just how bad Wilson was with regard to the issues of race and giving prominence to a part of the historical record many have never considered. Also good. In fact, exactly the sort of dangerous ideas on campus that many First Amendment enthusiasts were worried was being stamped out. So, okay, another internal check and balance in the protest movement, as far as I'm concerned. How will colleges respond to questions about the prominent place some institutions give Jefferson? At William and Mary, Jefferson's alma mater, the notes on the statue just appeared, without an individual or group claiming responsibility or formally asking for the statue to be removed. Sure, fine, why not? Officials have noted that the protest has not actually damaged the statue, so they are not treating the incident like vandalism. Okay? Fair enough. A university setting is the very place where civil conversations about difficult and important issues should occur. Non-destructive sticky notes are a form of expression compatible with our tradition of free expression, said a spokesperson via email. Fine. Students have been debating the issues raised by the notes on social media and in columns in the student newspaper, as you would want it. At Missouri, the Jefferson statue became an issue last month as tensions were rising over a range of issues raised by black students who cited incidents of racial harassment as well as campus culture issues such as the prominence given to a Jefferson statue. Closer call there, of course. But I would bet that even the student protesters would say, oh, well, in terms of ranking the issues, in terms of our demands, which ones do we want met first? Statue probably comes after stop letting people get away with driving by us in pickup trucks and hurling things at us and calling us the N-word. Let's not have that happening and no action be taken on that. And if that works out, then we can talk about the statue later. Maybe I'm wrong, but I anticipate that would be their position. We'll wrap this up. A petition is circulating, in fact, calling for the statue to be removed. And what's wrong with that? I don't know. Nothing I can think of. Nobody's even occupying the quad about it. They're just petitioning, which is sort of how you wanted them to handle the whole thing in the first place. The petition notes the history of Jefferson's involvement with slavery. Thomas Jefferson's statue sends a clear nonverbal message that his values and beliefs are supported by the University of Missouri. Jefferson's statue perpetuates a sexist, racist atmosphere that continues to reside on campus, the petition says. Does it overstate the case? Who knows? It depends on your approach to all things, the whole issue. Does his statue send a clear nonverbal message? No. It does send a nonverbal message. I don't think it's a clear one. If you choose to focus on the personal rather than the political accomplishments of Jefferson, and it's a legitimate thing to focus on, then things are clear for you. If you say, well, he was at best a mixed personality, then it's not going to be that clear. Does having a Thomas Jefferson statue say that the university is cool with racist, sexist atmosphere and everybody should rape any black women you see there and maybe make them slaves? I don't think so. But that's only because, it's only because Thomas Jefferson actually did an enormous amount for in the founding of the country, that we have spent a couple hundred years focusing on that stuff and not the bad stuff. And so we've got a long way to go before people say, on balance, Thomas Jefferson was a terrible guy, and that day may never come. But, and it seems to me that the likely outcome, if there's going to be a compromise on all this, is probably the statue remains, but perhaps some sort of additional historical notes might be made available in permanent form, bronze plaques, etc., near or in the vicinity of the statue. Otherwise, if we're going to be purging flawed characters and statues, well, I mean, it's not such a terrible thing if we were a statueless nation. But it seems to me that other issues brought up by protesters at the University of Missouri needed to be addressed first, and I think they would agree with that. And we probably are better off spending our time on those issues and then getting around to discussion of statues and what they mean before deciding whether we're going to go statueless from here on in. As Missouri and William and Mary are dealing with statues, there are, of course, institutions where Jefferson had an even greater presence. For instance, University of Virginia, where black students, like their counterparts at many other campuses, have been pushing a range of issues. There has not been a public debate on Jefferson's role on campus in light of the recent discussions elsewhere. The conservative blogosphere has widely mocked the student campaigns against honors for various historical figures, including Jefferson. The scholarly view of the situation, scholars of Jefferson and his record on race and slavery have been watching the debate with great interest. There is no consensus, there you are, among researchers on whether Jefferson's accomplishments, Declaration of Independence, advocacy for religious toleration, among others, are outweighed by a record on race and slavery that many argue wasn't just bad, but it was even bad for his time. Scholars have a range of views on whether Jefferson's statues and other honors should be reconsidered, but they generally agree that the public doesn't know enough about Jefferson's poor record on issues of race. That's going to be your first challenge. Again, if you can convince a broad cross-section of the community, and in this case, I guess, the entire nation, that on balance Jefferson's bad, I mean, that's a tall order, I think. But if you can do it, do it. I don't really know why that would be out of bounds. I'll read a little bit more about this because it's interesting. I think you may disagree, but then again, if you can organize a broad cross section of the community to tell me so, then go ahead and use the KITM hashtag to let me know. Paul Finkelman, author of Slavery and the Founders, Race and Liberty in the Age of Jefferson, said, that he couldn't judge how colleges should deal with Jefferson statues, but he said the history is clear. I don't think you go around honoring people for behavior that was truly awful. Well, that's true. By the way, let me finish this quote and then I'll respond to it. I don't think you go around honoring people for behavior that was truly awful, and Jefferson's relationship with slavery and race was truly awful, even from his own times. This is not looking back from now, he stressed. Okay, good point. I don't think you go around honoring people for behavior that was truly awful. I don't think that they are honoring him for behavior that was truly awful. They're honoring him for other behavior that was not particularly awful, but in fact is widely regarded in the United States as good stuff. Declaration of Independence, religious tolerance, just generally being a leaderly kind of guy. But he also did these things. That's not what we're honoring him for. So a better formulation of the question, giving Finkelman the better benefit of the doubt, probably is, I don't think you should go around honoring people even for their great stuff if they were also truly awful personally. Okay, closer call there, that's for sure, and a little bit more to the point. Finkelman, a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania program on democracy, citizenship, and constitutionalism, and the Ariel F. Sallows visiting professor of human rights law at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law, that's a long commute, compared Jefferson to George Washington. Interesting. We'll take a look at that comparison. But by the way, just to carry this to its logical conclusion, what if Ariel F. Sallows was a total bastard? Personally speaking. Now, he endowed a chair of human rights law at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law. Doubtless an enormous contribution to North American society, Anglo society anyway, and maybe even beyond. But what if he was a horrible, horrible racist or something, or misogynist? I don't know. Who knows who Ariel F. Sallows is? I apologize to the Sallows family. And he might have been a terrific guy. But the question remains, what if we find out later that he was in fact a vicious sadist? I don't know. Does that mean Finkelman has to resign from the chair, or just protest that it be renamed, or do we revoke all the money that he got paid by the Sallows family along the way, or the pay that was facilitated through this? You know how the system works. But anyway, let's take a look at what he has to say about George Washington. George Washington ceased using white overseers to manage his plantations before he became president, and gave the positions to slaves as a prelude to emancipating them in his will. Finkelman said, that's taken to be a good thing. I mean, it's not fantastic. You're still a slave. But okay, Jefferson never took such a step. Washington famously said that he did not take men to the market like cattle, but Jefferson sold nearly 100 slaves in the 1790s. All right, also bad. Henry Wiencheck, Wienceek, author of Master of the Mountain, Thomas Jefferson and His Slaves, said via email that his approach to the issue of statues and other honors for Jefferson, as well as Wilson and others, would be based on a Jefferson quote, "The earth belongs to the living." Aha. So Jefferson himself says, never mind the statues. Now, he explains, Wiencheck does, if the rising generation finds the actions of these men to be repugnant, then the new generation has the right to demand the removal of memorials to them. There should be an informed and reasoned discussion and debate. Universities are the ideal forum. Let the defenders of the memorials make the case on behalf of the enslavers. Terrific. I find that doable. And if the rising generation finds his actions so repugnant and are so persuasive in so finding that the older generations come to agree, or at least are no longer willing to stand in opposition, then guess what happens to the statues? You've just won the politics of the situation. Congratulations, and I have no complaints. Annette Gordon Reed, a professor of history and the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School, is the author of 2 books, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. She's the troublesome one there. She's not creating the trouble. I mean, she's the slave with whom or whose treatment creates the most controversy, I think, because that's where we get to the rapist part of things. Also author of The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family. She is among the scholars who have criticized previous generations of scholars for ignoring evidence or downplaying the story of Jefferson's relationship with one of his slaves. Via email, Gordon Reed said that she didn't think Jefferson's statue should be taken down. Further, she said it is important to distinguish Jefferson, whatever his record on slavery, from figures associated with the Confederacy or Jim Crow, for whom there may not be any reason for honors on campus to continue. That's an interesting differentiation. I understand why some people think his statues should be removed, but not all controversial figures of the past are created equal, Gordon Reed said. I think Jefferson's contribution to the history of the United States outweigh the problems people have with aspects of his life. He is just too much a part of the American story to pretend that he was not there. And that's not necessarily, by the way, what you'd be doing by removing the statues, it should be pointed out. We're not pretending he's not there. We're just simply not having a statue for him. I mean, there's no statue of John Adams on this campus because he didn't have anything to do with this campus, but that doesn't mean we're pretending there was no John Adams. He's just not singled out for any honors here, that's all. This conversation about statues and symbols really got going with calls to take symbols and figures from the Confederacy out of the public sphere. Then it shifted to every famous person who was an enslaver and or white supremacist, and why not, basically letting the Confederates off the hook. Well, that would be bad. That's a lot of people to be disappeared. There is every difference in the world between being one of the founders of the United States and being part of a group of people who fought to destroy the United States. That's a fair point, too. She added, it's a line-drawing function, but we all draw lines all the time. Statues and buildings for Jefferson Davis and John C. Calhoun? No. Statues and buildings for Thomas Jefferson? Yes, but with interpretation and conversations about all the meanings of his life and influences, good and bad. The words of the Declaration of Independence that blacks have made use of over the years, and Monticello, his home, a slave plantation that has now become a site for substantive discussions about race and slavery, exist together as a part of our history, just as he was. He drafted the Declaration, he was a president, he founded a university, he championed religious freedom. The best of his ideals continue to influence and move people. The statue should be a stimulus for considering all these matters at William and Mary and the University of Missouri. Okay, that is pretty interesting. Not where I thought I was going to go today, and yet it gives me an idea for some more stuff. Really, now I want to go diving way, way, way back into Pocket. How can I pull this up? I'm really going to have to rely on one of the searches. Wow. It was a Civil War piece that I put aside way, way long time ago. Let's see. Did I archive it? And it was a really interesting and controversial, I think, piece that I was really intrigued by the argument being made. Where did I put this thing? Because it wasn't Civil War per se, but it came up, of course, during the Confederate flag issue. Yeah, here we go. This is it. This is really, I think, an esoteric turn. But maybe only this show would do it. This is from August, which isn't ancient history, but in terms of what I put in Pocket, it's difficult to find. Politico magazine, interestingly enough, and Politico, I don't know whether Politico magazine will be making this turn, but well worth noting, I think, from over the weekend, I guess a new spokesperson being hired for Politico. That it was interesting. A lot of people found very telling. It was the hiring of Republican operative Brad Dayspring as spokesperson for Politico. So we look forward to his handling the first political and PR crisis for Politico, which would, of course, be his hiring. Anyway, I don't know whether that affects the magazine side. Here from the history department of the magazine side, discovering the myth of the lost cause in Montgomery, Alabama. How a search for a secret led me to discover the self-delusion of the South. I'm sorry, this is going to hurt for people who are Southern loyalists. I don't know how many real honest-to-God Confederate loyalists we really have listening to the show, but maybe with people with sensitivities? I don't know. Anyway, Mark Perry is the author of this, and before I dive into this one, I'll lay the groundwork or the connective tissue here between the previous stories and this one was Sally Hemings and the accusation that Thomas Jefferson is a rapist. There are, of course, people who put a softer focus on that history and say that there was a genuine relationship of sorts between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. I don't know whether that was the case. That's certainly the way it gets put in history books, so that on the one hand there might have been some truth to it. On the other hand, it's also easily explainable by saying, well, one, a little bit of Stockholm syndrome, and two, a little bit of Sally Hemings would have had no choice in the matter whatsoever anyway. The master says, you're going to be my mistress, and that's the end of it, and you don't really have any choice in it now. And it's a pretty complex situation, to say the very least, and I don't really want to analyze it much more than that. I think Mark Perry does a better job, and that's why I'm going to turn to him right now before I go off the rails here. But suffice to say that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to judge from the perspective of history. For me to judge any part of that probably would be impossible, but it makes it impossible to judge the tenor of the relationship, given that one of the people was enslaved. How can I read, were there tender feelings between them? I don't know. Is that even possible? You certainly can put on all the airs of it, and it might even feel genuine, but the dynamics of the situation are undeniable. Master, slave. And from there, everything's, at best, clouded in confusion. And probably more realistically, / at worst, horrible and abusive. So, with that in mind, let's take a really weird turn and go to this piece from Politico magazine. I found this fascinating. I said this would make great material, and then I never really got to a place where I could share it seamlessly. Now I'm there. Just so go already. In the late spring of 1996, again, written by Mark Perry in Politico magazine in August, in the midst of writing the last chapters of a book about the lives of two Civil War colonels, I came across a hole in my research so crucial that I'd had no choice but to get in my car and drive to Montgomery, Alabama, home of that state's historical commission. The gap had to do with the life of Colonel William Oates, a self-taught lawyer who'd commanded the 15th Alabama Infantry Regiment, which had fought in some of the Civil War's bloodiest battles at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, and Chickamauga. 30 years after Robert E. Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox, Oates was elected Alabama's governor. Okay, that was the problem. There was plenty of information on Oates' early life, and his service in Lee's army was well documented. There was also good information on Oates' post-war political career, when he'd used his war service and the empty right sleeve that resulted from it to gather votes. But there was a hint, just a hint, of scandal to Oates' life during his time as governor that involved his marriage that I'd been unable to unearth. The information lay somewhere in his personal papers, and so off I went. I guess that stuff hasn't been digitized and Googleized yet. Or at least it hadn't been in 1996. I have thought about this Montgomery trip many times in the years since, but most especially during this summer's debate about the lowering of South Carolina's Confederate battle flag. Like Ulysses S. Grant and Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, I had assumed the flag controversy would be intimate and ugly, with crowds of angry Southerners arrayed against a line of state policemen. It hadn't happened. The only time we saw the police was when they escorted the flag to its grave, while crowds of Charlestonians stood by in silent assent. And so, or so it seemed to me, and despite the fact that the flag is ubiquitous at anti-Obama events, the South had moved on, and the lost cause, so much a part of its history, had lost its luster. Had it? My drive to Montgomery back in 1996 included a visit to the Chickamauga battlefield in northern Georgia, where I checked in at the research library. Probably on Foursquare. Not really. All right. And what I found there, that was 1996. What I found there didn't help, but I came across two historians who were writing a book about Alabama's role in the Civil War. When I mentioned the Oates scandal, they smiled. You're not going to get much help in Montgomery, they said. The issue is just too sensitive. What issue? I asked. The two of them looked at each other before turning back to me. Check out a book by Virginia Foster Durr. D-U-R-R. Not a joke. That's her actual name. Durr. One of them said, she talks about Oates, and he left it at that. Montgomery was introduced to me the next day as I drove south by a large billboard that included the state flag and a picture of the State House, where Jefferson Davis, the Confederacy's first and only president, was inaugurated. Its message was jarring. Welcome to Montgomery, the billboard announced, cradle of the Confederacy, birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement. All true. I assumed Montgomery to be a bustling city, so made a reservation at a local hotel, plotted my course to the offices of the state archives, wrote to one of the archivists telling him when I would arrive, and asked for his help in digging out information on Oates' time as governor. But Montgomery was a surprise. There was angle parking on the street outside the archives with meters requiring citizens to deposit a nickel for every hour of use. And the historian I'd contacted smiled, shook my hand, and then reached for a pile of files he'd accumulated that I could read through. If you need extra nickels, he said, we have a box of them on the counter over there. At the end of the day, the archives were scheduled to close, and I handed the files back to him, shaking my head. This is all useful, I said, but it doesn't have what I'm looking for. I explained that I'd come across hints of a marriage scandal involving Oates, but there wasn't any mention of it in his papers. Never heard anything like that, he said, but I'll see what else we have. He returned a short time later, empty-handed. We close in 15 minutes, but I'm still checking, so why don't you just wait a bit? I said that I would, then watched as the room emptied, the last researcher depositing his files at the counter just after 5 p.m. The historian then returned with 4 large envelopes. I have what you want, he announced, but then hesitated. You didn't get this from me, understand? I was a bit surprised. Sure, fine, and I took the envelopes and opened them, and there it was, just as I knew it would be. What is it? Well, this is how the piece continues. If there's a model for Harper Lee's Scout Finch, it's Alabama's Virginia Foster Durr, an unflinching critic of segregation. Born in Birmingham in 1903, Durr went north to Wellesley College, where she was transformed from a conservative Southern belle into a progressive civil rights activist. But you could never take Alabama out of Durr, who described segregation as not only immoral, but as bad manners. See what I mean? Durr's sense of class was as finely tuned as an ever-vibrating quantum string. It's an interesting comparison. She scoffed when she was reminded that Alabama Senator Jim Eastland was rich. He's, quote, as common as pig tracks, she declared, a statement that might have been uttered by Scarlett O'Hara. In 1951, Durr moved with her lawyer husband to Montgomery, where in December of 1955, she paid the bail for Rosa Parks and was there to greet her when she was released. She was a friend to Parks, Ralph Abernathy, and Martin Luther King, which made her welcome on Dexter Avenue, but a pariah among her peers in Montgomery's upper crust Garden District. Lyndon Johnson wrote her letters, but she found Northerners who traipsed south to help the civil rights cause distasteful. She described them as hit-and-run liberals who showed up, quote, for a few days, but, quote, do not hesitate to sacrifice individuals to a cause in their own interest. In 1985, she wrote it all down in a book called Outside the Magic Circle. All right, ready for more? On page 160 of that book, in the midst of talking about her Alabama forebears, is the following entry. In his will, Colonel Church, a family friend, left some of his property to his black children and named my grandfather the executor and their guardian. That was the first time I had realized that all these relationships had existed. Some of the white men did protect their black children and educate them. In Alabama, when Governor Oates was running for governor, men got up in the legislature and said, Well, what about those, and here we are with the N-word, what about those N-word children you've got in the backyard? Whew. And the governor got up and said, what about them? I feed them, I clothe them, I house them, and I educate them. What do you do about yours? He got elected. And that was the great secret I wasn't supposed to discover. Back at Montgomery's archives, I'd spent an hour reading through the secret papers of William Oates, which described the black children he'd fathered and told how he'd kept them, his other family, hidden away in the backyard. How do you even hide people? From who? In the backyard. They had expansive backyards in those days. At the end of the hour, I handed the envelopes back to the archivist, who'd graciously stayed the extra hour while I did my research. He gripped the files in midair when I handed them back. Remember, he said, you did not get them from me. I nodded, but was puzzled. It's 100 years ago, I said. In Alabama, that's just yesterday, he explained, and added, you know, it's complicated. And how? I realized then that what I discovered in the Alabama archives was the myth of the lost cause, which consists solely in this, that whatever else the Civil War was about, it was not about slavery. This audacious claim, retailed by Confederate veterans in the wake of Lee's surrender, holds that virtuous Southerners died chivalrously defending a culture of benevolent masters set amidst a society of swaying magnolias and mint juleps, that the South was not defined by chains and overseers and mixed-race children, but by Tara and 12 Oaks. That it was not only Oates' second family that needed to be hidden away, but the unutterable truth that 260,000 Southerners died defending the indefensible. The myth of the lost cause has proven surprisingly resilient. Evidence of this came with the release of Harper Lee's long-anticipated novel Go Set a Watchman, written in 1957 but first published, coincidentally, 2 weeks after Charleston's Confederate flag was lowered. While Watchman has proved disappointing for many readers, it's mother's milk for those of us dipped in the myth of the lost cause. In a powerful scene in the book, Uncle Jack, brother of Atticus, is shocked when his niece, Jean Louise, Scout, argues that Southerners died defending slavery. His angry response is an iconic restatement of the lost cause myth. Consider Macomb County. Maycomb, M-A-Y-C-O-M-B. You tell me about pronunciation. He says, it's typical South. Has it ever struck you as being singular that nearly everyone in the county is either kin or almost kin to everybody else? Now, I'll hold on a minute here. I'm getting some rather interesting messages here. Sounds like we're having some difficulty with our feed. Okay, the feed is looping this Virginia Durr quote, or am I losing my mind, asks Kate Sherrill. And I have a message here from Justice that says something else is going on here, too. Let me see if there's something I need to do to fix. No? Okay, all good now? All right. Well, it could have been a worse part that got looped over and over again. And if you've missed anything, I will have the podcast up and ready for you probably super early. We're going to try and aim for having podcasts available at least on Libsyn by 11:30 today. Okay, so getting on with things. We're now back with the passage from Go Set a Watchman. Right? Consider Macomb County, says Uncle Jack, Atticus's brother, to Scout. It's typical South. Has it ever struck you as being singular that nearly everyone in the county is either kin or almost kin to everybody else? He then goes on to argue, has it never occurred to you that this territory was a separate nation? No matter what its political bonds, a nation with its own people existing within a nation, a society high paradoxical, with alarming inequities, but with the private honor of thousands of persons winking like lightning bugs through the night. No war was ever fought for so many different reasons, meeting in one reason clear as crystal. They fought to preserve their identity, their political identity, their personal identity. Interesting way of looking at it, of course. Young Virginia Foster Durr, that was the first time I had realized that all these relationships existed. And young Scout Finch Why didn't you show me things as they are when I sat on your lap? Might not have known what Uncle Jack meant by kin or almost kin, but South Carolina's Mary Boykin Chestnut, yet another unflinching Southern woman, certainly did. She not only understood it, but also talked about it in her Civil War diary. Almost any Southern lady, in quotes, she wrote, is, quote, ready to tell who is the father of all the mulatto, that's her word, children, in anybody's household but their own. Those, she seems to think, dropped from the clouds. For Chestnut, the South's original sin is the self-delusion, both ugly and very intimate, that allows Southern ladies to titter away about the mulatto children in any other household but their own. It is this self-delusion that allowed Uncle Jack and Atticus and James Eastland and Bull Connor to substitute the phrase political identity for the word slavery. And it was, as I learned in Montgomery, a self-delusion shared by Confederate Colonel William Oates. In February of 1863, Oates became convinced that the South would lose the Civil War unless, somehow, Southern armies could match the numbers put on the battlefield by the North. So he traveled to Richmond, where he met with James Lawrence Pugh, a Confederate congressman. What the South should do, Oates told Pugh, was free the slaves and enlist them as soldiers. Enlist. And free. Well, free them, but enlist them. That's a great, well, you know, it's par for the course as far as these guys are concerned. I guess it would even the odds. Pugh shook his head. If we free the Negroes to make soldiers of them, he responded, that is simply throwing aside the bone of contention, and we had well as stopped the war at once. Interesting, right? Oates was stunned. Like Uncle Jack, he was convinced the South was fighting for, in his words, home rule, local self-government, but separate national independence. Pugh knew better. The South wasn't fighting for any of those things. It was fighting for slavery, right? So if you take the slaves and you free them and enlist them, well, then what's the point of anything? Now you've freed the slaves, we might as well just quit the war. Of course, why you'd have to free the slaves in order to enlist them, I have no idea. Why not simply make them fight as slaves? But, well, that would have been a bad idea from the point of view of a slaveholding South anyway. But anyway, beside the point. Southerners aren't the only ones with a history. All those Northern boys, some 390,000 of them, 70,000 of them black, in Southern graves, well, they didn't die to overturn the South's unique culture or political identity. They died to end slavery. So we might celebrate the lowering of the Confederate flag, there's at least one final challenge, and one that I did not meet when the Montgomery archivist told me, you know, it's complicated. I nodded when he said this, becoming complicit in the delusion that Southerners fought the Civil War to preserve their identity. A myth that, despite the lowering of Charleston's Confederate flag, persists to this day. Complicated? Actually, I should have said, it's not. Now, that was a very interesting bit, I thought. Mark Perry, by the way, I'll help you out with the identification here. A writer who lives in Arlington, Virginia, author of 4 Stars, the inside story of the 40-year battle between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and America's civilian leaders. And you can follow him on Twitter, too, at Mark Perry DC, M-A-R-K, in case you're wondering, P-E-R-R-Y, D.C. Interesting. So I would recommend that. What does that tell us? And how do we tie that to Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and whether or not it's proper in history to regard him as a rapist? Wow. Well, one thing that it puts out there for consideration is whether, in fact, the leading gentry of the South fought the Civil War. Yes, it was about slavery, but what kind of slavery was it really about? It was certainly the economic impact of, you can't end slavery because we wouldn't be able to operate our plantations, and the economic part of it is at least we're taught about that, and not everyone believes it, and I guess they don't teach this in the South some places. But I don't know, maybe they do, to great controversy, but, we are all at least familiar with, even if we reject, wrongly, the idea that it was about slavery and the economic implications of it. We can't run the Southern economy without it. You can't maintain the Southern aristocracy's way of life without it, et cetera, et cetera. But in addition, it appears that the Civil War, an actual war that, by the way, as he rightly points out, kills 390, I don't even know, I guess it's just 390,000 dead northern soldiers buried in southern graves. I don't have offhand, I'm not a Civil War scholar, the statistics on casualties, whether he's just placed them all, the entire northern casualty list in southern graves or not. I don't know. I mean, I guess they all pretty much ended up in southern graves because that's where the war was fought. But anyway, hundreds of thousands of people dead in an honest-to-God war, honest-to-God killed. Why? Slavery, yes. But economic slavery only? No, it turns out a little bit of sex slavery as well. I mean, you've got the Civil War Southern gentry fighting the war to preserve their ability to keep sex slaves. Bottom line. Well, I pick out female slaves, women slaves from among my holdings and make them my mistress, that is, my sex slave. There's really no other way to put it. If you're actually literally honest to God enslaved and owned as a human being, I don't really care it doesn't matter to me for 150 years later anyway. I'll speak with that arrogance, I guess. It doesn't matter very much to me. I'm not judging, but I am. I have to tell you that there's no serious relationship that I can contemplate between the two of you when one of you is enslaved. No matter how well you treated them. Oh, I treated them so well. I let them live in the backyard. Really? Because there's this fabulous manor house that you have, and really it would be a nice place to live. But the backyard, I'm sure, is great too. Thanks a lot. Thanks a heap, Dad. Anyway, that's rather disturbing to find out that hundreds of thousands of people end up getting killed because a relatively small number of aristocratic Southern gentlemen like having sex slaves. Isn't that a great idea for a war? Okay, well, there was more involved, too, plus the entire economic basis of the South. Yes, sure, if you want to be technical about it. But how's that for a context within which to consider the legacy of Thomas Jefferson, who did likewise. Though he never fought a war over it, it just wasn't necessary for him to fight a war over it. And I don't know what to tell you, but that's a new way of viewing the Civil War. How do you like that? That'll get you kicked out of a lot of places pretty quickly, but you'll probably be right. How do you like that? Take that with you take it with you to Thanksgiving. Going down south for Thanksgiving, hosting Southern relatives, hosting anybody who's even a Northern enthusiast of the lost cause. Let them know that you've just read or had read to you an article that asserts that the whole thing was fought because they were super serious perverts and they wanted to be able to keep enslaving sex slaves. And but they were nice and they put food out in the backyard for any children that resulted. Ridiculous, unbelievable, and how embarrassing. And no wonder then that you would put so much energy into insisting that the war was about something else. It would even be a relief at that point to say, you know what, it was about slavery, but it was about the economic kind where they made them pick cotton for free and we whipped them and we sold them. I'd rather face that one than the idea that we literally had a war because these guys couldn't contemplate going without their sex slaves. That's a little tough to face up to. But I don't know. I guess at some point you're going to have to, if you're going to have an honest accounting of what went on. The articles exist. People said what they said and did what they did, and we'll either have to face it or not. All right. Well, how's that for wrapping up a show? There's plenty more to discuss, of course, and we've got more time to do it, thankfully. So we'll face more such discussion, I'm sure, during the rest of the week's of the show here. Let me just flip back and see if there's any way I can lay out a path forward here. Now, Pocket doesn't want to really cooperate with me, but we'll have to catch up on Donald Trump and his, I don't even know what to call it, well, racism is a pretty good term for it, I guess. And I see Twitter is going crazy with the reminder that he retweeted some graphical representation of some data that is 1, wrong, 2, racist, and 3, comes from an avowed neo-Nazi. And, he doesn't take his rhetoric all that seriously and never really feels like he needs to answer for it. But at some point, if you're contemplating nominating him for president, we're going to have to confront this stuff. What are we talking about? A so-called, a purported USA crime statistics graphic, which basically trots out the old trope of, oh yeah, what about black-on-black violence and black-on-black murder, et cetera, because aren't you the real racists, et cetera. And of course, as it turns out, not only is the information wrong, but it's being circulated by white supremacists and neo-Nazis. And I imagine that Donald Trump, if he had known that at the time, might well have said, okay, well, given that foreknowledge, I might perhaps choose not to share that information in this fashion. But then again, you never know, and there's nothing you shouldn't worry about in putting things past Donald Trump. He'll do almost anything. We have, of course, a good opportunity in an interesting article from the Washington Post to turn to the a long-running and long-acknowledged, but to this point on the show anyway, unexplored story on civil asset forfeiture, and something that a lot of other progressive shows and, of course, postings on Daily Kos has explored in the past. Law enforcement took more stuff from people last year than burglars did. That's an interesting way of putting things. But we'll have to close things out today, having, maybe shocked the conscience or shocked some people's consciences. Maybe they already knew about this stuff, by asserting that the Civil War was fought not just for slavery and in defense of slavery, but in defense of sex slavery. I never. Anyway, if you hang on today, as you should, to listen to the rest of the programming day here at Netroots Radio. Next up is Metaphor Monday version of the After Show. What's up with them? The fate of over 4 million people could rest with Justice Antonin Scalia. I assume you're all going to die. That being the case, Donald Trump says his supporters were right to beat up Black Lives Matter's protester. One in particular, another story that I neglected from over the weekend, just to illustrate by way of how bad things have really gotten out on the campaign trail for Donald Trump among his weirdos. And Martin O'Malley justifies the discredited Ferguson effect. Oh no, you were so close to catching fire, Martin O'Malley. For the last half, they'll be reporting on what it's like to be a Syrian refugee in America. Dangerous, dangerous times for those folks. All that plus the Connect, Unite, Act, Daily Kos community calendar, and more on the After Show with Wink and Justice coming up next. Sorry for any of the broadcast difficulties we may have had. Look for our podcast to be posted right away.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Thanks for hanging on for the show. We'll be back tomorrow and Wednesday, and then, of course, off for Thursday and Friday. Whether we can put together some fresh material for you to enjoy over that, well, gee whiz, it's a crapshoot. We'll see what we can do for you. I'll do my best in between shopping trips and cleaning up for the folks. Talk to you later.